We'll start the main part of the presentation shortly, but first, hi and welcome to my very long video about the history of police in America. Okay, so actually let's start with that part. It's a long video, about an hour actually. I've put timestamps between each of the major sections of the essay. Feel free to come or go as you please, and these can be found in the description below. Personally, I find them super helpful because I have a short attention span and sitting through an entire hour's worth of YouTube content at once is a struggle for me. You could even skip this little introductory part if you like. That'll shave a few minutes off the top anyway. Okay, so here's the next thing about the length. An hour is a long time for a video, but incredibly short for condensing 300 years of history into. Don't take this video as your Bible on American police. I've done my very best to include as many of the most relevant topics as possible and give them equal weight, but it's really more of a macro introductory look at the topic rather than an exhaustive scrutiny of each of those little details. Maybe you could call it an exhaustive introduction? Maybe. I've tried to include as many citations and outside resources as possible. I'm hoping that this inspires at least a few of you to go out and learn more about this topic once you've finished listening to me talk about it. Frankly, it's all really interesting stuff, and it was super hard for me to cut it down to just an hour's worth of content. It would take me a year or more to talk about everything that I wanted to, but that sounds like an exhausting watch even to me, so I'll spare you that. I've also done my best to keep my personal biases out of the body of this essay. I am human, so there's gonna be some bias. This ain't Reuters, but do you want it to be? Anyway, the bulk of this essay is just gonna be me giving you the history of American police, which I'm fairly confident speaks for itself. If you stick around to the conclusion, I'll let you have a little of my personal analysis as a treat. Or, again, shave a few minutes off and skip that part entirely. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. Anyway, you're not here for my charm, charming though I may be. So let's start the show, shall we? The history of policing in the US does not actually begin with the police. Both the word police officer and the idea of the police are younger than the US itself is. In fact, what effectively served the function of the police in early America would have been more familiar to a Westerosi than it ever would a citizen in 2020. George R.R. Martin did not invent the idea of the Night's Watch entirely from thin air. Rather, the concept has historical roots in the job of night watchman, which was a staple of the criminal justice system in colonial and early post-colonial America. It's worth noting that this concept was not an American original, but rather a part of the English common law system that was brought over to the Americas by the British Empire. The history of American policing, at least for the first few hundred years, was closely intertwined with the development of British policing. Unlike a policeman, a night watchman was not a career law enforcement officer. Rather, it was a volunteer, generally rotating position fulfilled by members of the community. I say volunteer with quotes because it was apparently a position people rarely actually volunteered for, but rather one which was often forced on them through draft or as a form of criminal punishment. Yep, the actual Night's Watch was often made up of criminals, and volunteers like Jon Snow would indeed have been quite a rarity back then. Regardless, the system of night watchmen was better than nothing for the small agrarian communities which dotted the early American landscape. Few, however, would argue that those years weren't relatively lawless, especially since most of the people charged with protection of a village or hamlet were not in that position by choice. In order to help alleviate this issue, there were a relatively small number of individuals with the career title of constable. Constables were more similar to modern police in that they were, to a degree, permanent law enforcement officers. However, their actual functions within a community were much more varied, with only a few actually having anything to do with law enforcement. In fact, their most important function so far as enforcement was concerned was in their administrative role over a town's night watchmen, though this was not a role that all constables shared. All in all, the system of constables and night watchmen was not an especially formal system of law enforcement, which was reflective of early American attitudes towards organized federal governance by an armed force. Early Americans fought a war of independence against a tyrannical monarchy.
Who is the King of England? Why, the tyrant King George, of course!
One which maintained its order through an occupying military force. American revolutionaries, on the other hand, had made heavy use of volunteer militias to establish and maintain their independence. I mean, one of the very earliest amendments to the Constitution, the third, is one which prohibits the forced quartering of troops in American households. It's no surprise, therefore, that the early American system of law enforcement was an especially decentralized one. The prevailing theory at the time was that a state police force would usurp and eventually destroy the role of the local militia in American life. However, white American fears of standing organized law enforcement stopped just short of thinking that black people should be governed in the same way that they were. When various informal means of slave suppression proved less efficient at protecting slave-generated income than the slave-owning class would have preferred, America, especially in the South, developed its first prototypical organized criminal justice system, the slave patrols. The first slave patrol was formed in the Carolinas in 1704. From their onset, the slave patrols had three main functions: apprehension and return of runaway slaves, to strike fear into slaves so that they would not run away or rebel in the first place, and to be a formalized system of justice, heavy air quotes around that word there, charged with punishing any slave who violated plantation rules. In an era when having armed law enforcement was a controversial idea that was unpopular with most Americans, slave patrols were typically armed with whips or even guns. There's a tendency to draw a sharp division between the few rich, slave-owning whites and the more numerous, poorer, working-class whites of that era in order to implicitly exonerate the latter from being a part of that horrific system. It's important to note, in face of false claims that only 1.4% of whites owned slaves in the antebellum South, that all white men in early America were not only eligible for slave patrol service, but it was actively expected of them, regardless of class. In fact, in some states, every single white man was expected to arrest and punish any runaway slave they found. The slave patrol system, in effect, formalized a social hierarchy wherein all white men were complicit in upholding the institution of slavery, regardless of whether they actually owned any slaves themselves or not. Ultimately, two things came out of the slave patrol system. First, as America's first formalized law enforcement system, they were the ancestral progenitors of the modern police system we continue to operate under today. And second, though patrols were outlawed along with slavery itself at the close of the Civil War, they continued to exist in Southern policing strategies throughout Reconstruction, and in the strategies employed by the newly formed Ku Klux Klan. In no uncertain terms, both the KKK and American policing are rooted in the slave patrols of 1704 to 1865, a fact which will, unfortunately, be relevant as we proceed in this retrospective. While the slave patrols were America's first semi-organized system of law enforcement, the world's first modern police force is historically credited as being the London Metropolitan Police. Because this is a video about the history of policing in America, I don't really want to spend all that much time talking about Scotland Yard, but there are a couple of things worth noting. First, the American suspicion of a standing police force was shared by, and likely derived from, the British. Fears of a standing, occupying domestic military force meant that the Metro Police were designed to be seen as a civilian force. In fact, this is why police in London, and incidentally the US, wear blue uniforms to distinguish from the red uniformed military of the British Empire. The perceived need for a more efficient police force in London was a direct result of the Industrial Revolution, which saw an explosion both in total population and population density. By the time the Metropolitan Police were officially formalized, London had already become the largest city in the world. Rapid urbanization and industrialization had not only made it the world's most populous city, however, but also its financial capital. Just as the slave patrols in the United States were born from a need to protect financial investment and slave-generated profit, the London Metropolitan Police were born from a need to protect and maintain the financial interests of the London mercantile class. Rapid populational development coinciding with rapid industrialization also saw London's population become more and more economically unequal. With greater income inequality came greater levels of squalor and unrest, which would eventually give way to larger and larger labor protests, for which the police were seen as a necessary force of suppression. But as I so often do, I am getting ahead of myself, so before we talk about that, let's check back in on the colonies. While not to quite the same degree as foggy London town, US cities in the early 19th century were also industrializing and growing at an incredible pace. As I stated earlier, the US criminal justice system largely followed the British, and so it's unsurprising that similar forces, those being industrialization-fueled economic and populational growth, led to the generation of institutions similar to the London Metropolitan Police. The first of these modern American police forces arose in Boston in 1838, New York in 1844, Albany and Chicago in 1851, and Cincinnati in 1853. That year also saw the opening of the first modern police department in a southern city, New Orleans. Still, slave patrols remained the most common form of policing in the South before the Civil War. By the close of the post-war Reconstruction era, which was around 1880 or so, all major US cities had some sort of official police force. The primary question is, what is it about cities that made official standing police forces go from an institution held in contempt and deep suspicion to one which was seen as a social necessity? I've been alluding to some answers to this question already: increasing total population and density, as well as a widening wage gap between rich and poor. But those are only base factors. The question is, why did these factors lead to the modern policing era we now live in? There are a multitude of explanations for this, as it is a topic that has been heavily studied and researched over the years, but it would take way too long to get into all of them in this video. So I'm going to be giving a couple of interrelated explanations, beginning with the simpler of the two. Cities offer more opportunity than rural areas do. This was especially true during the industrial era, but as someone who grew up in a town of less than 20,000, if you don't count the college, I can confirm that this is still generally the case. With the greater density of a wealthier population, it simply follows that crime, like most jobs, pays more in a city than it does in a town. I mean, I personally moved to a distant city because it offered me greater opportunity for crime! Greater population density can also lead to more direct confrontation between those of different backgrounds. This is a factor which will be discussed at greater depth later, but it is important to at least note here. There is evidence that some of the early police departments in the US arose as a response to increasing social tensions between urban white populations and increasing numbers of urban immigrant and black populations. Remember, the 19th century was a time of increasing liberty for minority populations, especially after the Civil War, as well as greater xenophobia against a growing number of immigrants. These populations were seen as a threat to whatever the traditional American was, which led to both the segregation era and the drafting of all of the country's most severe anti-immigration laws. When white people were brought into closer and closer physical proximity to black and immigrant people, the number of violent incidents against them likewise increased. Oh, and in case my participles are dangling there, I mean white violence against black people and immigrants, because always. This leads into what is likely the most significant factor in the advent of US police departments. Research has shown that the then new police system was not, on the whole, a response to crime, but rather disorder. The distinction between these two words may not be immediately apparent, but it is extremely important. According to Dr. Gary Potter, Associate Dean of Eastern Kentucky University's School of Justice Studies, this distinction is rooted in, quote, social control. And when police departments were starting to dot the US map, it was capitalist business interests which were at the helm of that so-called social control. One advantage to criminalizing disorder is that it is a nebulous word whose exact meaning is contingent on the one defining it. In the early days of the American police, disorder was blamed on those who belonged to the so-called dangerous classes. The dangerous classes, of course, being those who threatened capital profits. Definition of the dangerous classes was also rooted in eugenics, a growing movement in the US at the time, and broadly included those deemed biologically inferior, uneducated, and immoral. Unofficially, the dangerous classes were made up of freed black people, immigrants, and the poor. This was easily sold to the wider white American public, whose Protestant work ethic already strictly defined morality in terms that included them and no one else. And because I can't resist a horrifying Nazi tie-in, Hitler's racial policies were cribbed from the American eugenics movement because, of course they were. If you're interested in learning more about this, please listen to the Behind the Bastards two-parter on phrenology, linked in the description. For the capitalist class pushing police development, however, disorder ultimately meant protest against the social hierarchy they themselves were at the top of. Remember that bit concerning rapidly developing inequality? Working conditions during the mid to late 19th century were the worst that they have ever been in this country's history, and while industrialization made a few Americans inordinately rich, most people were significantly poorer and worse off for it. Eventually, these would be the conditions under which American labor unions were born, for whom we must thank for weekends, paid vacation and sick leave, work breaks, child labor laws, the 8-hour workday, and workers' compensation, among many other things we now take for granted. Even before organized unions, though, the most effective bargaining tool available to American workers was through striking, or rioting, according to the economic elite. This equation between strike and riot is especially important because while the police were officially an organization developed for fighting disorder and rioting through violence and arrest, the exact disorder in question was the working class and non-whites, and the rioting was protest against economic inequality and unfair working conditions. But don't just take my word for it. According to Dr. Potter, maintaining a stable and disciplined workforce for the developing system of factory production and ensuring a safe and tranquil community for the conduct of commerce required an organized system of social control. The developing profit-based system of production antagonized social tensions in the community. Inequality was increasing rapidly. The exploitation of workers through long hours, dangerous working conditions, and low pay was endemic, and the dominance of local governments by economic elites was creating political unrest. The only effective political strategy available to exploited workers was what economic elites referred to as rioting, which was actually a primitive form of what would become union strikes against employers. The modern police force not only provided an organized, centralized body of men, and they were all male, legally authorized to use force to maintain order, it also provided the illusion that this order was being maintained under the rule of law, not at the whim of those with economic power. In the early days of the police, the most effective means of controlling labor strikes was through making what were called public order arrests, which included a broad range of crimes that, in one way or another, disrupted the flow of money to the capitalist class. It is estimated that 80% of these arrests were against workers, and in the last quarter of the 19th century, approximately 1 million people were thrown into jail a day for what were essentially trivial public offenses. While violence was always a tool the police had against labor unrest, early American attitudes towards a standing police force in general meant that 19th century police were significantly less armed than they are today. In fact, it was still heavily debated whether police should be allowed to carry guns at all, which is unbelievable in an age where police have literally dropped bombs on American citizens. But the fact is, armed police better serve the system they were created to participate in. Late 19th, early 20th century America was notoriously corrupt thanks to a system in which the wealthy owned the politicians and the politicians owned the police. Rockefeller is still a synonym for unimaginably wealthy because even today, we have yet to see another man who owned more of the world's capital than he did. America was in the pocketbook of a few robber barons who effectively had complete monopoly over its industries, while its working class suffered under worse conditions than we can even fathom today. Unless you look at American factories overseas. It was in this world that the police arrived to be the paramilitary force whose ultimate role was the preservation of that order. So while the public at large may have been uncomfortable with the idea of an armed police force, such a thing was very much to the benefit of the people paying them. It's common to paint the police of this era as being as corrupt as the monopolistic industrialists and self-preserving politicians, but the fact is, they were simply fulfilling the purpose they were created for, to protect the property of the wealthy. Some of the earliest signs of police militarization came after the Philippine-American War, which is yet another horrific piece of American imperial history that very, very few Americans are even aware of. If you would like to know more, here's a video with a pretty decent introductory explainer. Spoiler alert, we weren't the good guys. After the war, the US gained imperial control over the Philippines from 1902 until the 1940s. The first action taken by the United States in order to maintain control of the Philippine Islands was to establish the Philippine Constabulary, the police force which would succeed the US military in its role of suppressing Philippine independence movements, and which would eventually become an integral part of the Philippine Army in the 1930s. The legacy of the Philippine Constabulary is a brutal one, and while it was disbanded in 1991, it is worth noting that His Excellency Rodrigo Duterte, the current nationalist president of the Philippines known best for his use of death squads, wants to bring it back in order to aid in his war on drugs. Remember this when we talk about America's own war on drugs later. It is also worth noting that the lessons learned in the establishment of the Philippine Constabulary were directly applied to the development of America's own domestic police force after the Philippine-American War, thanks to a veteran of both that and the preceding Spanish-American War by the name of August Vollmer. Vollmer, known informally as the father of modern policing, began his career in law enforcement when he was elected town marshal of Berkeley in 1905. In 1909, he created, and became the first to hold, the office of police chief. This was the moment that Vollmer would begin reforming the Berkeley Police Department, and throughout the next decade, he would be invited as a consultant to police departments throughout the country. The reforms brought about by Vollmer are worth discussing because they represent the first tangible nationwide push towards police militarization. While early American distrust of an organized police was in their fear of governance by an armed paramilitary force, police history in the US from 1900 onwards would see greater and greater adoption of explicitly military tactics and weaponry. It is Vollmer who is credited with not only founding the academic field of criminal justice, but also for establishing the first police training schools. Unsurprisingly, given Vollmer's history as a U.S. Marine stationed in Manila to protect American imperial interests against Philippine independence fighters, these academies drew heavily from American military tradition. He himself stated that the structure of these schools was inspired by U.S. Army practices at the time, military science being one of the primary subjects taught within them. Vollmer also started the previously unheard of practice of regular weapons training with military-grade firearms. He even started a junior police youth program designed to attract the interests of the next generation of police officers. Among other things, the junior police programs are known for putting children through regular military drills and instructing them in military tactics. Police reformers like Vollmer had the clear goal of making U.S. police a domestic army all its own, one which sought to establish order through the same sorts of tactics used by the U.S. military to subdue the people of the Philippines, whose own Declaration of Independence the United States did not recognize. I say police reformers like Vollmer because he was not the only person in this movement, though he is the most well-known. According to one study, about 40% of all American police departments had at least one military veteran as a police chief from 1890 to 1915. As the late 19th and early 20th centuries were America's period of greatest direct military imperialism, see the U.S. annexations of Texas, California, Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Samoa, it's safe to say that nearly all of these veterans came either directly or indirectly from a background of imperial suppression of ideas and movements which ran counter to the will of the American state. But again, don't just take my word for it. Vollmer himself stated, "For years, ever since Spanish-American War days, I've studied military tactics and used them to good effect in rounding up crooks. After all, we're conducting a war against the enemies of society, and we must never forget that." Of course, nothing of that addresses who the so-called enemies of society actually were that Vollmer and other police reformers were employing military tactics and equipment against. Who even gets to decide who those enemies are? We can only speculate at what Vollmer would have to say about that, but it should be noted that students at his police academy in Berkeley, quote, took courses in which they learned about different racial types and how heredity and race degradation led to criminality. State violence against Black people and immigrants through law enforcement was as strong under Vollmer as it always had been. All the groundwork laid by the corrupt policies of the late 1800s and the militarization of America's police in the early 1900s was precipitously accelerated once the Volstead Act went into effect in January 1920. Though the ensuing era, more commonly known as Prohibition, lasted just 13 years, its impact on policing continues to be felt today. Prohibition is known as the period of U.S. history when alcohol was illegal. While this is essentially true, the actual legal story was significantly murkier. In fact, though the Volstead Act prohibited the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, possession and consumption remained legal. In practice, Prohibition cost the U.S. billions in lost tax revenues and enforcement while also creating a perfect environment for organized crime to satisfy American thirst for booze. Much again like the war on drugs would, but hey, who's counting? There is a reason why American mafia movies almost always take place during Prohibition. At no point was such widespread crime so nakedly visible to the average citizen. But while everyone thinks of Al Capone when they think of that genre, the violence and corruption that made for such compelling film would not have been possible without an equally violent and corrupt police force. The sudden need to enforce the prohibition of alcohol expanded the powers of both the criminal justice system in general and the police in particular overnight, and to a degree heretofore unknown by this country. When the police had started to arm themselves some 10 years earlier, it was with 6-shot .38 revolvers and pump-action Winchester shotguns. While these were the same firearms being used by the Army at the time, the advent of the Thompson submachine gun in 1918 meant that by the Prohibition era, police departments had widespread access to a firearm which was capable of firing over 600 rounds of 45 ACP a minute from its 50-round drum magazine. The Tommy gun, so deeply associated with the Prohibition era, was a gun unlike any that the public would have believed at the start of the decade, let alone one which would be officially adopted by so many police departments. And while the official excuse for such police armament was the rise in violent mob crime, in fact, the police in many major cities were actually a part of the mob themselves. William Hale Thompson, Chicago's last Republican mayor, was infamously on Al Capone's payroll, as was his chief of police, Charles Fitzmaurice, who is quoted as saying, "60% of my police are in the bootlegging business." The old cycle of the late 19th century was every bit at play during the 1920s and 30s. The wealthy owned the politicians owned the police, and the police enforced a system which ensured that those with money and power retained their monopoly on that money and power. Prohibition was overturned in 1933, and by the time it was, American trust in the police was at an abysmally low level. To the average American in the 30s, the police as an institution were corruption manifested. That said, while police access to military firearms like the Thompson became a permanent fixture of American forces, public distrust in a militarized police as a force of corruption would only last a few years after Prohibition. The global war on fascism would unify the public in a way that made concerns about internal corruption less pressing, and Cold War politics after the Second World War would actually begin a reversal of public opinion about the police. After Hitler offed himself and the alliance between the US and the Soviet Union dissolved, the world was divided into two spheres, the capitalist West and the communist East. This ushered in an era wherein the US tried to distance itself as much as possible ideologically from the USSR.
Since I was a small boy, 2 states have been added to our country, and 2 words have been added to the Pledge of Allegiance: under God.
Paranoia gripped those in power, and in the late 1940s and 50s, the Red Scare saw a de facto criminalization of all things which might be considered communist. Of course, just as with the dangerous classes of past eras, definition of that which was communist and therefore anti-American was determined by the state and those in power. Specifically, it was determined by the House Un-American Activities Committee, most notably during the era known as McCarthyism.
You're not asking the question.
I was.
The chief investigator's asking the question. Now, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
McCarthyism, which lasted from 1947 to around 1957, refers to a period when the FBI, the House, and the Senate spied on US citizens in order to prove some sort of connection between them and communism. To be found guilty, which could happen if one were found to have any sort of connection to a left-leaning organization or left-leaning individuals, regardless of the nature of that association, meant losing one's job, being blacklisted from other jobs, and even jail time. McCarthyism has long since been discredited as a witch hunt, one in which unscrupulous politicians accused others of being un-American for their own gain. Anything could be considered communist, even those things which have nothing to do with politics. For example, homosexuality, which was believed to be counter to the ideals of the so-called American family, was equated with communism. To be queer meant risk of jail on the charge of communism. Of the industries most affected by McCarthyism, those who worked in film, theater, or the arts were at particular risk, and most notably for this video, civil rights activists were under constant suspicion and even jailed for their un-American activities. Senator Joseph McCarthy, the man for whom McCarthyism was named, was formally censored by the Senate at the end of 1954. He died 3 years later from complications due to his alcoholism. This officially brought a close to the era of McCarthyism, but like the retention of a militarized police force after Prohibition, the impact of McCarthyian paranoia outlasted the era it was born in. And by the time the civil rights era rolled around, allegations of civil rights activists' ties to communism and the Soviet Union would see an even further expansion of US police militarization. One of the earliest and most obvious clashes between growing civil rights unrest and expanding police power in the US was during the Birmingham campaign led by, among others, Martin Luther King Jr. A nonviolent movement that aimed at putting an end to legal segregation, the Birmingham campaign is infamous for the police's use of fire hoses and attack dogs on protesters and bystanders alike, including students and other young children. This clash between the civil rights movement and the police would continue throughout the decade, and is yet another topic which I could dedicate hours to while only scratching the surface. So I'm just going to read some bullet points here. If you'd like to learn more, I'm putting links in the description to some of my favorite videos and podcasts that better discuss this era. In 1964, riots in Harlem began when a white police officer shot and killed James Powell, a 15-year-old black kid. According to witnesses, this happened after Powell threw up his empty hand in a sign of "Don't shoot" after the officer pulled his gun on him. The riots went on for 6 days after that, resulting in one protester being killed and over 100 injured. Police used tear gas, nightsticks, and gunfire to suppress the protest. A similar riot in Philadelphia later that year resulted in hundreds more wounded. In February 1965, white police officers beat a group of black nonviolent marchers with nightsticks. During the melee, veteran and civil rights leader Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by a white state trooper who shot him twice in the abdomen. This sparked the Selma to Montgomery marches, which were also organized in order to address the issue of black votes and voter registration being obstructed by white officials. Though non-violent, this also led to incidents of police brutality through the use of tear gas and nightsticks. It should also be noted that, in a move which echoed the organization of the old slave patrols, all 21 and older able-bodied white men in Dallas County, Alabama were called on by the sheriff to be deputized in order to stand against the marchers. The Watts riot in Los Angeles in 1965 began when white police officers arrested a black 21-year-old for reckless driving. According to witnesses, the police used unnecessary force on both the original person in question and a pregnant black woman who arrived later on the scene. This escalated into several arrests, which gave way to widespread riots. This would lead to 34 deaths, over 1,000 injured, and thousands more arrested. Notably, most of those arrested had no prior criminal record. Police Chief William Parker, who is famous for coining the term Thin Blue Line, considered the riots to be an insurgency, likening the protests to the Viet Cong, and believed a paramilitary response was necessary for what he considered to be, quote, urban guerrilla warfare. This event also led to the LAPD's development of SWAT, which will be discussed later. The 1967 Detroit riot was one of the largest and deadliest riots in American history. It began with the mass arrest of everyone in a local speakeasy, 82 in total, who were gathered to celebrate two GIs who were returning from Vietnam. This attracted a huge crowd of onlookers. Detroit had had huge and growing racial tensions as a result of redlining and de facto segregation. It was under these conditions that the crowd of onlookers became riotous, and over the next few days, 43 people died, over 1,000 were injured, and more than 7,200 more were arrested. 33 of those deaths were black protesters, 23 of which were shot down by either police or National Guardsmen. Oh, and the 1969 Stonewall riots are an important thing that I want to mention because I'm writing this during Pride, but they don't really fit anywhere else, so I'm jamming them in here. Learn more about how a riot against police led to the decriminalization of homosexuality and the beginning of the gay liberation movement here. The civil rights movement was held in deep suspicion by the federal government in the post-McCarthy Cold War era. Along with the militarization of civil state and local police forces, the federal law enforcement agency, the FBI, was well known for its subversive attacks against any group or organization deemed to be un-American. McCarthyism was long dead by the 1960s, but the excuse to attack political opponents on the grounds of them being alleged communist sympathizers remained well established. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the series of FBI operations known collectively as COINTELPRO, which were officially conducted from 1956 to 1971. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was established to counter any sort of political movement deemed subversive by the FBI. Among those targeted were, unsurprisingly, the Communist Party USA, but also organizations related to feminism, anti-war, especially in Vietnam, animal rights, environmentalism, territorial independence, most notably Puerto Rican independence and United Ireland movements, and leftism in general. Oh, and as has been heavily hinted at, civil rights organizations, including the American Indian Movement and Black civil rights movements, including wiretaps of Martin Luther King Jr., surveillance of the NAACP, and assassination of members of the Black Panthers, among others. In the spirit of fairness, the KKK was also targeted, but as one might expect, somewhat differently. For example, after Viola Liuzzo, a white woman, helped organize and participated in the Selma to Montgomery marches, she was assassinated by 4 members of the KKK in a drive-by. 3 of the men were sent to trial. The 4th, an FBI informant, avoided charges. In order to cover their tracks, the FBI smeared Liuzzo by stating that she was a known member of the Communist Party USA and a heroin addict. She died in 1965 with no traces of drugs in her system, and the truth of her murder did not come out until her children procured FBI documents under the Freedom of Information Act in 1978. By the time COINTELPRO was discovered and discredited in 1971, which only occurred when a group of citizen activists burgled an FBI office in Pennsylvania, the FBI made up about a fifth of the KKK's membership and nearly 3/4 of its then recent growth. It's unsurprising, therefore, that the paramilitary organization created by the FBI at the time, the so-called Secret Army Organization, was created from the ashes of the Minutemen, a militant far-right group. Certainly not a good look for those who would deny historical relationships between white supremacy and American law enforcement. There are endless examples of police brutality and militarization throughout mid-century America, but while I don't have time to go over all of them or examine them to near the degree they deserve, each is the result of broad trends towards police reform which occurred after the Second World War. With absurd levels of police corruption during Prohibition fresh on the collective American memory, improvement of public image became a chief concern to domestic police departments. The first of these was the drive for greater professionalism. Professionalism broadly refers to the set of trends started by August Vollmer earlier in the century and was aimed at centralizing police command while also transforming police into a reactive and even preventative force through the use of patrol cars and two-way radios. This was later expanded by his pupil, O.W. Wilson, who emphasized the need for, quote, military-style organization and discipline. The perceived omnipresence of motorized police was supposed to be a deterrent for would-be criminal activity, while a centralized and more bureaucratic structure would help eliminate the earlier problem of influence and control by politicians. This was to be further augmented by subdividing departments into certain specializations, such as vice and homicide, and by rotating officers' posts to different parts of the city, so that they would not develop any sort of closeness with the community they were policing. Because of their focus on greater integration with military-style practices, it is no wonder that police militarization and thus violence increased significantly under Wilson's reforms. Perhaps this could be seen as a necessary price for eliminating the corruption which so pervaded police departments in previous decades, but in practice it not only drove a further wedge between communities and the police that governed them, but it also had little to no tangible effect on corruption. Under Wilson's reforms, police departments became nearly wholly isolated from the communities they allegedly served. According to Potter, professionalism antagonized tensions between the police and the communities they served and created rancor and dissension within the departments themselves. The crime control tactics recommended by the professionalism movement, such as aggressive stop-and-frisk procedures, created widespread community resentment, particularly among young minority males who were most frequently targeted. Police professionalism and the military model of policing became synonymous with police repression. He goes on to quote Samuel Walker from The Police in America in introduction, stating, "A half-century of professionalization had created police departments that were vast bureaucracies, inward-looking, isolated from the public, and defensive in the face of any criticism." In fact, corruption became even cheaper under professionalism, as the now subdivided departments meant that criminals no longer had to corrupt entire police departments as they had under Prohibition. The existence of smaller units meant that a drug lord only had to corrupt vice, for example. The negative effects of the professionalism movement were not lost on police officers themselves. With greater centralization and bureaucratic expanse, police departments became highly autocratic and authoritarian organizations. Rampant corruption and increasing police brutality in the post-war era saw many officers united in fixing law enforcement from within. In the ultimate twist of comedic irony, the same organizations whose origins were in strikebreaking began to unionize. By the early 70s, nearly every major US city featured a unionized police force. However, the 1970s were also a difficult time economically in the US. Inflation, reduced tax generation, demographic shift, etc. all meant that cities had fewer funds to allocate to police, and thus police unionization also coincided with departmental shrinking and officer layoffs. The response to this, therefore, was further division of labor and further specialization within a smaller and even more isolated department. Of course, this meant that many of the issues with the era of police professionalism, isolated bureaucracies, and highly divided labor persist into the current era. It's easy to trace our most current iteration of policing in the US over the years when we look at all the periods that came before it, but it's impossible to understate the influence the war on drugs and the war on terror have had on the extreme militarization of our police over the past 40 years specifically. There's a reason why our collective image of the police has gone from this to this. When President Richard Nixon declared in 1971 that
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
he set forth a chain of events and a chart for this country that have each far outlived his own self. America having more incarcerations per capita than any other country on Earth, though a topic partially outside the bounds of this video, can be directly attributed to Nixon's war on drugs. More relevantly, it is specifically responsible for the greatest expanse of police militarization yet, a tradition which has only snowballed since Watergate. The Nixon presidency coincided with the rise of SWAT forces, which were developed as a direct response to the riots and protests of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. SWAT, short for Special Weapons and Tactics, represented the most militarized manifestation of police to date, effectively a military police force in all but name. According to John Nelson, a former LAPD officer and the so-called father of SWAT, the initial idea behind SWAT was that a small unit of highly equipped officers would minimize police injuries and casualties in violent situations. Initially, these violent scenarios in which SWAT was deployed were mass riots and protests, though in reality, one of the first SWAT deployments by the LAPD involved the use of a grenade launcher in a raid on a group of Black Panthers. It should be noted that most charges against the Panthers were dropped when it was ruled that they had acted largely in self-defense against, a squad of armored troops wielding a grenade launcher. While the war on drugs began with the Nixon administration, its impact on police militarization didn't really begin its eye-watering acceleration until Reagan was elected into office in 1980. This is perhaps most plainly manifested in the increase of armed raids on suspected drug targets by SWAT teams from the 1970s through the 1980s, which went from a few hundred yearly under Nixon to more than 3,000 in the first few years of the Reagan administration, a number which would increase by over 1,000% by the mid-90s. But the exponential increase of SWAT raids only gives a glimpse of the overall picture. In 1981, Reagan's first year in office, the ominously named Military Cooperation with Civilian Law Enforcement Agencies Act was enacted. The primary prerogative of this act was to allow the U.S. military to cooperate with domestic and foreign law enforcement. Prior to this act, the military and police were, at least de jure, wholly separate. This is the act which first granted law enforcement access to military bases and equipment, making police militarization more of a tangible reality than ever before. Of course, the war on drugs was the primary excuse for it being enacted, though its broad language meant that it was not limited to drug enforcement. It's so hard to not shift focus to America's massively increased incarceration rate during and since the Reagan years. I know this is a video about police, but the prison system and the police are interrelated systems, and the war on drugs had a monumental impact on both. Drug laws enacted by Reagan disproportionately affected Black people and other minorities. The 1986 Drug Abuse Act, for example, stated that being caught with 5 grams of crack, which was primarily used by inner-city Black people, was the same as carrying 500 grams of cocaine, used primarily by suburban white people. As has been discussed, police brutality against Black people was significantly more endemic than brutality against white people, and the war on drugs has been a continuation of that legacy. In 1990, George H.W. Bush enacted the 1033 program, which allowed military surplus equipment, weapons, and vehicles to be transferred to police departments for use in drug enforcement. The images and videos you see of military in armored vehicles ramming civilian buildings are a direct result of this program. Billions of dollars worth of military equipment have been transferred from the U.S. military to over 8,000 law enforcement agencies since the 1033 program was initiated. Among the materials transferred to police departments are aircraft, helicopters, bayonets, knives, night vision sniper scopes, tactical armored vehicles, rifles and weapons including grenade launchers, watercraft, and camouflage gear. Police militarization continued to escalate in 2001 when the terrorist attacks on September 11th led then-President George W. Bush to declare,
"Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them."
It's cliche, but 9/11 changed everything.
Brian, are you suggesting that 9/11 didn't change everything?
What? No, I was just...
Because 9/11 changed everything, Brian. 9/11 changed everything.
We are still living out the ramifications of the post-9/11 era, but among them is a fundamental shift in the way terrorism is handled on American soil. Prior to the attacks, the police were the ones primarily responsible for combating terrorism on American soil. The war on terror, however, meant that the duty was now passed to the military. The lines between the military and the police in America have been blurring for nearly as long as there have been police in America, but the war on terror meant that the marriage of the two was nearly complete. The old styles of policing were no longer good enough in the face of global terror. The police had to adapt even further to a, quote, warrior's mindset, purchasing even more military equipment and engaging in even more military training. However, the reality of this further blending of wartime military and domestic police means that all that equipment, all that training, is not confined to counter-terrorist activities. Beat cops have become more and more heavily armed in the years since Bush's declaration, and SWAT teams have been more and more frequently deployed for routine causes, betraying the special that makes up their acronym. It's worth noting that while Obama limited some of this militarization by his executive order in 2015 by restricting parts of the 1033 program, Trump rolled this order back in 2017, his first year in office. Obama's order was but a brief blip in the rapid militarization of America's police, and today, America is not only number one in total incarcerations, it is number one in the number of civilians shot dead by police of all developed nations. Incredible, really, considering that early Americans were so adverse to the idea of an armed, organized police force at all.
Please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
Well, I promised some sort of personal analysis at the end, didn't I? So, guess I need to make good on that. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the topic of American policing is massively complicated, and I hardly consider myself an outright expert on the subject, so honestly it's hard to know where even to begin. Then again, it was difficult for me not to insert my own opinions throughout the body of the essay, so never satisfied, I guess. Let's just start with this. It's probably very clear where I stand at this point, but just in case I've not been as overt as I thought I've been, let me just state where I stand right now. Our policing system is very wrong. It's not broken, as many claim it is. It's a system that works exactly as intended, stretching all the way back to the slave patrols of the early 1700s. It is, in my view, impossible to look back at the history of law enforcement in America and not come out of it without seeing it as, at least to some degree, morally wrong. To me, it's a rather significant degree. I mean, look back at all of the recent police murders. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others. None of it is new. Police violence against the working class and marginalized people in general, and Black people in particular, has been a part of the system for as long as there has been a system. Look at the history of law enforcement from any period in American history. You'll see the same sort of endemic issues that we see in police departments today. And year after year, decade after decade, it doesn't get better. It gets worse. I grew up in a conservative white household, in a conservative white part of an especially conservative white state. Growing up, I was implicitly taught by everyone around me that the police are heroes, that they are the good guys, and if I wanted to be good myself, it meant supporting the police. I mean, obviously, the only ones who wouldn't support police are bad guys, right? Right? The topic of militarized police is an especially interesting one to me because, honestly, I've only ever known a militarized police. And this has led to some pretty terrifying self-reflection on my part. How did we get here? Why was I ignorant for so long? How can all of this exist in plain sight with a list of receipts dating back hundreds of years? Again, it's a system working exactly as intended. It's a system that relies on that degree of privilege in order to sustain itself. One other note about 9/11 that I didn't mention specifically in the main portion of the video, the impact that it had on our social fabric as civilians, specifically the idea of patriotism, and how the language surrounding what it was to be a patriot somehow became synonymous with what it was to be right. And I don't just mean right in the political sense, although that's also applicable, but I mean right as in correct. Growing up when and where I did, to be a patriot meant to support the military in all of its actions and a blind acceptance of all American military action as good. Because I grew up basically understanding that the police were the domestic branch of the American military, that meant that to be a patriot, and therefore correct and good, meant extending that same blind support to American police and all of their actions. Never mind the fact that the people I know who make up the police back home were the cruelest, most racist and homophobic kids that I grew up with. And the ones who joined who didn't fit that bill, they didn't last long. My understanding of the police growing up was that they fought crime in the same way that soldiers overseas fought terrorism. What was crime? I guess I just accepted that it was whatever I was told that it was, and that criminals were thus anyone who fit that description. Laws were simply there to protect us, and if everyone would just follow the law, we wouldn't have any problems. But what if laws are not just? If they're evil or cruel? What if they disproportionately affect one group over another? What if they're there simply to protect the profits of those who already own all the wealth, to give them a monopoly on violence as a means to suppress anyone or anything that might threaten their bottom line or their hateful worldview? I do honestly believe that there are many, many cops who join the force out of a genuine belief that they're doing the right thing, that they're helping those who need it, that they're protecting their communities, that they're doing whatever they can to make America a better place. I have no doubt that there are those who join thinking they can reform the system, that they can be the good cop that defeats the bad cop. I absolutely believe that there are those who join the police for all the right reasons, with all the right intentions, out of a place of genuine goodness. I also believe that such people are being used by the system the same way the rest of us are, because ultimately it's not a cop's job to interpret the law. It's not even their job to question it. Their job is to enforce the law, any law, no matter what it might be. And there's no way one can uphold goodness while agreeing to such a position. The Nuremberg defense didn't hold up in 46, and it doesn't hold up now. Enforcing evil simply because it's one's job to do so is still evil. And America's policing system is one with a centuries-long list of receipts of evil. of racism and white supremacy, of corruption, of classism and homophobia, of war against its own people, war against us. Post 9/11 patriotism may define all cops as heroes, but given the circumstances, I hardly feel that that's the best word to use there. In giving the state, and I mean state with a capital S, control over a standing army of well-equipped soldiers that are willing to uphold any laws that they define as just, we are paving the road to authoritarianism. Hell, we're way past that point, honestly. The Second Amendment, the one that is supposed to protect citizens' access to guns, it wasn't written to protect us from criminals. It was written to protect us against a tyrannical state. But somewhere in there, the people who control the purse strings flipped that narrative. And how tragically effective they were at doing that. Thank you so much to my amazing patrons who helped make this and all of my work possible. It's my hope in making this video that it causes a few people to question the narrative that we've been fed, that it teaches a few people about a history that has existed in plain sight for so long, that it causes a few more to go out and read and research and learn about this very, very important topic. I know it isn't perfect. I know that I don't go into explicit detail on everything, and that there are some pieces that I don't begin to give the credit their due. But I do believe that it's a good introduction, that I do give some tools. I don't often do calls to action at the end of my videos, but if you found this video helpful, please share it. Way more people need to be aware of all this than currently are. Because even in knowing just what I've put here, it's so obvious that what has been happening to our Black communities was only a matter of time. And that's a horrifying realization. And it needs to change.